everybody. Welcome to the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos Comparative Religion class. Today we're going to introduce Hinduism. I've been waiting to do this for a long time, ever since we did Zoroastrianism, which was our last class was a long time ago. We've had things come up and we haven't had class. But I think Zoroastrianism was the last thing we talked about. And it was a great introduction to Hinduism because Zoroastrian and Hinduism are very related. And ever since then, I've really been excited to teach this class. So let's get started. So if we review what we did last time, we spoke about Zoroastrianism. And we talked about how it was a dualistic religion with the prophet, and that many of the elements of Christianity evolved, we believe, out of Zoroastrianism, and that Zoroastrianism had a strong impact on Judaism and on Christianity through that, including the belief in the devil, judgment, afterlife, kind of a final battle and all that sort of thing. So that was our discussion last class. Now remember, Zoroastrianism arises in this area in Persia, right between Mesopotamia, which is here, and India, which is here. And it sat right between the two, and it combined Mesopotamia, their deities, their ideas, with some Indo-Aryan and Vedic ideas. But it demonized the Vedic tradition. So, for example, Ashura is a malevolent deity in the Vedic tradition, and Ashura becomes a benevolent deity in the Zoroastrian tradition. The Devas are the name for the gods, and so in Vedic tradition, they're benevolent deities, and in Zoroastrianism, they become malevolent deities, and in fact, our word devil probably comes from that. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So today's lecture, Hinduism is a big topic. We're not going to cover all of it. We're not even going to try. But what we're going to try to do today, I believe, is to introduce Hinduism, just kind of as an overview. We'll talk about what Hinduism is and give you a broad picture. And then we'll dive into its history with the Indus Valley civilization, the Aryan invasions and migrations, and the Vedic civilization that arises. And these are the roots of Hinduism, so to speak. And we'll get right up to the point where we get into the time when they start talking about meditation and enlightenment and that sort of thing, right when Hinduism becomes kind of Hinduism, and that's when we'll run out of time today. And then the next class we'll dive into the Upanishads and the renouncers and meditation and the rest of that sort of material. So, Hinduism is the third largest religion on the planet. And the unaffiliated maybe have just barely ticked it out, but they're not really a cohesive group. So Hinduism becomes the third largest after Christianity and after Islam, and the vast majority of Hindus live in India and in the regions surrounding India, Bangladesh, that sort of thing. And it's, for the most part, remained geographically isolated, and despite that, it's very large. It's geographically isolated, and it hasn't really had much impetus to leave India. It's not missionary in that sense, and India is a sacred place for the Hindus, and so it is for the most part stayed in India. Hinduism is, well, perhaps the only real salient feature of Hinduism is that it's radically diverse. After the British occupation, you get everything from puritanical views about sex to wild, abandoned views about sex. You have wandering sages, colorful deities, and beautiful temples carved out of the face of the rock itself. And this is Hinduism. And so Hinduism itself is a difficult concept to explain and to teach because it's not even an indigenous concept. It's a Western concept. The indigenous people of India didn't have a name for their religion, and they didn't even have a name for religion itself. They didn't see religion as separate from any other part of life. And so that was just a way of being. And it's only as you contrast their way of being with the outside world and the outside influences that words that describe the difference begin to make sense. And now today many Hindus will use the terms Hinduism, religion, etc. But those are Western concepts, and they're not even indigenous. They're not really indigenous, and possibly don't even describe Hinduism. In fact, one of the major worries about using the term Hinduism is that it gives you the impression that there is a single Hindu religion. And it might be better to think of Hinduism as a conglomeration of many different religions that all have some things in common. Okay. One of the few things that Hinduism has in common, if we try to come up with something, is A, its diversity, and B, a view that facilitates diversity. Namely, that it's impossible to really know the truth, no one really knows, there is no singular truth, and the fundamentals or essentials of all religions are the same. There is difference only in the non-essentials. Swami Sivananda. Now, I've talked about this quote before. It's a beautiful sentiment, and it's great if it's a statement of your own faith in what is essential and what is not. As such, it roughly approximates my own view. If, however, it's a statement of what you think other religions are like, it gets you into trouble, because other religious traditions do not believe that they differ only in the non-essentials. They will see some of their differences as very essential to them. My religious faith is that the things that the religions share are the things I believe in, and the things they don't share are the things I don't believe in. But that's a statement of my own beliefs, not a statement of description of the state of religion in the world. We need to be careful not to pretend religions are all the same. They're not. But Hinduism shares this sort of belief, that their truth is one, but the sages call it by many different names in the Rig Veda. That should be R-I-G, Rig Veda. So the idea here is that there is a mountain, and there's an analogy that is often used. There's a mountain, and the top of the mountain is what all religions are seeking. And there are many paths up that mountain. It doesn't matter which paths you climb. The paths are different in the foothills, where it doesn't matter. But by the time you get to the top, you're all at the same peak. The other analogy that Hindus will often refer to is the elephant. A bunch of blind men touching the elephant and saying, oh, it's a wall, because one is touching its middle. And one says, oh, it's a tree trunk, because one is touching its leg. And someone else says, it's like a snake, because they're touching its tusk. And it's like a fan, because someone else is touching its ear. And that's how they see the different religious traditions. Now, as we go through the history of India and the history of Hinduism, hopefully you'll see where this comes from and why they have this view. Because there is diversity within their own tradition. And so holding this view allows them to hold that tradition in its contradictory entirety in their own mind at the same time. So that it's not just about how Hindus will relate to the outside religious communities and other religions. It's about how they relate to their own traditions and the diversity within it and the contradictions within it. In later Hindu tradition, the top of the mountain is escape from samsara, moksha, and the experience of the Atman, the soul, and this spiritual revelation that happens through personal experience. And it doesn't matter how you get that experience as long as you have it, which is again why they're quite willing to talk about different paths up the same mountain. It doesn't matter if you believe in this God or don't believe in that God. It doesn't matter if I had the opportunity to teach several Hindus on my mission in Florida who had immigrated, and they were, to my fundamentalist mind at the time, they were frustrating as heck to teach. Because I would teach them about Joseph Smith, the Book of Mormon, and they'd say, yeah, that's great, I love it. And they'd give me a copy, and they'd go home and they'd read it and tell me how much they love it. And then the next day they'd go sacrifice their chicken to their, they don't do that. But that's how it felt like to me. But they would offer, their sacrifices to their idols in their home. And they had these idols stuck up on their home. And to me at the time, that was just horrific. And I could not get them to give up that. It was easy to get them to add this. It was very hard to get them to give up that. Because they didn't care if I came to the realization experience at the top of the mountain through Joseph Smith, or if it would even help them get to that experience. They're willing to use Joseph Smith. But to say that there's only one path up the mountain was antithetical to their beliefs, and they wouldn't do it. And so that is possibly the only real salient thing we can say about Hinduism, is that they all seem to share that particular pluralistic view. If that is a typical Hindu belief, that's it. The other three that we see commonly, although not perfectly, but commonly we will see belief in reincarnation, which in this tradition is not a good thing. I know that in the West we sometimes find solace in the idea of reincarnation, and our yoga teacher will reminisce about the beauties of reincarnation, and you get to live all the different lives and marry the person who didn't marry this time, and you know, be born again and again, and maybe you'll get it right someday, and it seems like a beautiful thing. Reincarnation is not rebirth. It was originally called, in fact, in Hindu tradition, re-death, because this life is suffering, and to be reborn means to have to die again and again and again and again, and it's a horrific thing that you are supposed to escape from, which is the idea of karma and liberation. Karma being this idea that what goes around comes around, and it's also what binds us to the wheel of reincarnation. We leave this life with an extra weight of good or bad merit, either one. And good merit will force us to be reborn in a better life, and bad merit will force us to be reborn in a bad life. But either way, we get reborn, and we have to escape merit altogether. Escape duality, escape merit, escape samsara, and that is the process of liberation. That's what's at the top of the mountain. Of course, these are all later traditions. We'll talk about, as we talk about the origins of Hinduism, we'll talk about a time before these things, but we're giving you a broad overview of the tradition as it stands today. So the other thing is that they will talk about is that there are at least four values that someone could strive for realistically in this life. There is the Dharma, which is righteousness or moral values, the Artha, which is prosperity, economic values, Kama, pleasure, psychological values, and Moksha, liberation. And so in this idea, there is nothing wrong with seeking pleasure. There's nothing wrong with seeking prosperity and money and gain, as long as you do those things within your Dharma, which is your duty and your moral obligation to your neighbors. So you can go out and seek pleasure. Thus kind of the refreshing view of sex in early Hinduism, right? You can go out and you seek pleasure, and that's a worthy gain of life. Or you can go out and you can seek prosperity and money and economic value. That's worthy. Or you can seek, to just further your Dharma and your moral and your duty. And you go out and work for your duty. Or you can seek liberation. The problem is the first three are in tension with the last. But reincarnation gives them a framework in which all of them are good. Because if you do the first three right, you'll end up with a better rebirth, because you'll have a positive weight of karma. And if you get a better rebirth, you have another shot at moksha in the next life. And so seeking a better rebirth in this life is a valuable thing, and seeking release in this life is also a valuable thing. And you don't have to go all the way to release. But the problem is that last one requires relinquishment of the first three, and thus the tension. And they'll see all of, and I find this to be a beautiful idea, because now I don't have to reject pleasure as an evil thing, but I might have to stop being so attached to it. And it turns out that people who do that tend to be happier and nicer and better people. You'll also notice, if you're familiar with Buddhism, some of the origins of the traditions that will later evolve into Buddhism are already buried in here. Okay. So that's in a very broad picture stroke, an introduction to Hinduism. Now what we're going to do now is go into its history and do it in greater depth. And then we'll go into, this is the old period, then we'll do kind of a middle period, then we'll do a later period, and then we'll do a modern period. And as we go through those time periods, we'll see Hinduism evolve into the sort of thing I just described. It doesn't start that way. So the Indus Valley civilization is sometimes called the Harappan civilization. And it is one of the three cradles of civilization on the par of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and so it's one of those three, the Indus Valley, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. We usually talk about the first two and leave out the third. The reason we leave out the third is because we don't know as much about the Indus Valley civilization. In fact, it was only rediscovered in 1850. Some of the primary sites were only excavated in 1920, and we just don't know very much about it. We do know, however, that it was one of the places where agriculture was discovered, modern cities arose, and they were planned cities with complicated governmental structures. And so this is one of those fundamental cradles of human civilization. It belongs on the list with Egypt and Mesopotamia. It's called the Harappan civilization because Harappa was one of the cities that was excavated where we kind of learned the most about them. These are pictures from Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, two of the Indus Valley civilizations that have been excavated. And again, the other reason we don't know as much about them is almost everything we know comes from archaeology because their script, and this is an example of it, is obscure. They were literate, but they didn't seem to write the sort of they didn't write profusely the way the Egyptians did. I mean, the Egyptians write on every stone that's exposed, they'll write something. And so we had so much volume of Egyptian text to help us crack Egyptian. Harappan has never been cracked. We don't know how to read it. So here we have a script. They were literate, but we don't know how to read it. We don't have a lot of it, and that's part of why we don't know how to read it. And so we don't even know what they called themselves. Now, if we contrast that with Egypt, where we have the largest known corpus of religious texts, the oldest, largest corpus of religious texts, the pyramid texts. So if you want to read the oldest religious writings known to man, you can read them, and they're a good couple inches thick in translation if you get a good book, which is a translation of the pyramid text. That's what we have from Egypt at its almost inception. And in the Harappan civilization, we have almost nothing. So again, this is one of the great civilizations known to man, and yet we know almost nothing about it. Part of that is the bias of the West. Our Western biases we've done more archaeology in Mesopotamia and Egypt. But the other part of it is I think even if you had put the same effort into understanding this civilization, we still would have struggled. There just isn't as much there, especially with the untranslated script. But what do we know from archaeology? That's all we've got, anthropology, archaeology, excavations. Well, the first thing we can say about the Harappan civilization is that they seem to be kind of obsessed with cleanliness. They have ritual baths, we think they're ritual, in the center of their cities and in most of the homes. They had running water, which is impressive stuff. And they had washing stations everywhere. Now, this indicates to most people who look at it that they were not just interested in hygiene, but in ritual purity. So, if you were here during the Zoroastrian religious discussion, they were obsessed with ritual purity to a degree beyond anything we see in Judaism and elsewhere. And we think they get it from here. And so we think that what we're seeing is the beginnings of that sort of ritual purity tradition where you wash not just to remove physical dirt, but spiritual or ritual or what's maybe the right word? Karma is not the right word, but this idea of social inaction or when you take or disorder when you do so. Harappa is here. Mohenjo-daro is here. Indus River Valley. So social disorder creates, and sin in Jewish tradition creates ritual impurity that has to be washed away, is the view. And it has that same psychological process that causes us to that it's related to hygiene in the sense that the same physical processes in our brain that make us feel dirty when we're dirty make us feel dirty when we do socially bad things too. And so washing is the natural response to that, and it creates the belief in ritual purity. And this is, again, something we see in Zoroastrianism, but it's also something we see in modern Hinduism today. The other thing that we find a lot of in the Indus Valley civilization is a lot of these terracotta figures. They're usually female with wide hips and large breasts, which implies a religious significance. And when people who reconstruct civilizations without texts that they can actually read, whenever they say something has religious significance, it usually means they don't understand it. Because if something weird happens, it doesn't make any sense. You say, well, it had some religious significance. But in this case, what we probably have are worship of a female goddess of some sort, or at least something related to female fertility rituals and beliefs. When it comes to male sexuality, we usually get this sort of thing. These are from those same seals. These seals were used to stamp products that were then shipped. In fact, we find impressions of them as far as Mesopotamia, and I believe even some in Egypt. And so they were trading with Mesopotamia and Egypt. They were connected to the rest of the world. And they mark ownership, which is part of the reason you can't read this stuff, because they're almost certainly names. And that makes it even harder to crack. But you'll notice the emphasis of the animals with the large horns, large flanks, and always male animals. You can see the phallus, etc. And there's almost a feeling that you want to appropriate the male sexuality of the animal. We also find lingams. In 1940, archaeologist M.S. Vats discovered 3 Shiva lingam. They're called Shiva lingam because they're used in Shiva worship today, but we don't know that's what they were used for in Harappa. But Shiva lingams at Harappa, dating more than 5,000 years old. This archival photo shows that the ancient Shiva lingam, as it was being excavated from the Harappan site. That's to the right. At the bottom is a more modern Shiva lingam. These are used in the worship of Shiva. The bottom piece is a representation of the female anatomy, and the top piece is a representation of the male anatomy, and the union between them represents the creative powers embodied in Shiva. And so this is placed in the bottom, it's placed in the back of the temple in the Holy of Holies, where it represents, the birth of the universe through this sexual act. It's a pillar that in later times represents the male member, so it's phallic. And so what we have here is possibly a hint that they're already worshiping Shiva, but more likely that they at least have this connection to sex and sexuality, so their religion is tied to sexuality. This is not unusual for the ancient world at this time. People of the ancient world were obsessed with sex, and the reason they were obsessed with sex wasn't because they like sex like all of us do. That's the same for us too, but because they were obsessed with the creative power. It's the same power that you take a seed, you plant it in the ground, and a crop grows up. So you take a dead body, you plant it in the ground, does it come back to life? You have animals and humans that mate, and children are produced. What does that mean? Where does this new life come from, and how can we harness the powers of new life for fertility, for our crops, but also for our children, to have children, and is it tied to how the universe was formed? You see what I'm saying? It was a philosophical question, and so the religious traditions were tied to sex and sexuality. We also have in one of these seals this fascinating image with 3 faces of an individual in what looks a lot like the lotus pose, so possibly meditating. On the right, we have a picture of Shiva as the Mahayogi, a meditating Shiva. And he has a trident, which looks an awful lot like the horned headdress on the left. And again, with the animals underneath it, etc., this looks very similar. And one of the questions is this a prototype of Shiva that's already present? So here are educated guesses about the Harappan civilization. They're interested in ritual purity. We can see how that translates into modern Hinduism. They're interested in sexuality with the male animals and the female goddess and figurines, and the Lingam yonis. And they're interested possibly in meditation. If that picture is of a meditating individual, then meditation was already part of this tradition as far back as it goes. And they're very interested in social order. You can tell that just from how the cities are laid out. They're not haphazard. They're ordered, organized with sections and straight lines, and they're very, very interested in creating correct order. And that's really all we know, unfortunately, because we're dealing with a civilization without writing that we can read. All right. Let's talk about the Aryans for just a minute. The Aryans were pastoral nomads. They had horses. They had a language known as Sanskrit. And they brought with them a scripture known as the Veda. And they had already a stratified society. We'll talk about all of this. And they seemed to move from the northwest down into India. They also moved into Europe. And so there's evidence of the same Aryan culture and migrations throughout Europe. Most of that evidence is linguistic, but now we have some that's genetic as well. And I see similarity between the Hindu religion and Proto-European religion as well. So, and as well as the sort of thing, remember we had a class a long, long time ago, years ago, about Nordic religion and the Norse mythology. There are similarities to Norse mythology. There are similarities to Greek mythology. And so, again, some of this is probably due to Aryan influence, as well as the language they brought with them and the scriptures they brought with them. So, let's talk about their language for a minute. The language is Sanskrit, but it's Indo-European in its origins. We call it because there's also a lot of European languages. English is an Indo-European language, so we'll see a whole bunch of cognates. So one of them is Deva. Deva is the Sanskrit word for God, deity, divine. It means glowing one. And so Deva goes into English as divine, but it goes into Latin as Deus, and that goes into Greek as Zeus. And through a really interesting turn of events, it comes into English as the devil. Divine, devil come from the same Deus. We believe in Deva. And the reason for that is through Zoroastrianism. Because you remember Zoroastrianism took all the Devas and turned them into demons. And so through the Indo-European religion or language, we get the word divine from as a good thing. And then through Zoroastrianism, we get the same word back with a slight variation as an evil thing, and it becomes devil. Again, probably through Zoroastrianism, and that's probably where the whole devil idea came from in the first place. We also have the Vedas, which are the religious texts we're going to talk about today. That word means wisdom through seeing. And so we have a cognate video in English, to see. We have Rita, which is a very important concept we're going to talk about today. If you can think all the way back, and I know some of you weren't here, but a lot of you were, if you think all the way back to the Egyptian lecture, we talked about Ma'at. Ma'at is truth, justice, and the Egyptian way, right? And the problem with the world was chaos, and the solution was to establish Ma'at. In Hindu traditions, Rita is what you try to establish. And from that, again, some of these etymologies are speculative, but I'm not the only one making these speculations. From Rita, we probably have right and right, as in right, correct, and right as in a ritual. And you will notice those two things, those two words are integral to what the Vedas, the Aryans, believed Rita was. Rita was ritual order, or order, cosmic order that was established through ritual. So Hindu tradition at this stage looks almost identical, in my mind, to Egyptian religion in the sense that the purpose of the religion isn't to just create a great, better afterlife. That happens in Egypt too, but it's also to establish cosmic order. through the right words, the right rituals that all go back to creation and this sort of thing. That's Rita. We also have Agni, who's a deity of fire, from which we get cognates ignite. And Atman, which is the spirit, the soul, and the breath, and from that we have English atmosphere, etc. So we have a lot of these cognates because the Indo-Europeans spread into the Europe, into Britain, into English, and down into India. And so, India becomes a place of, from its inception, as a religious Hindu tradition, it becomes a place of melding, where you meld the Indo-European Vedic tradition with the native Indus Valley civilization. Now, the scholars originally believed, let me back up for just a second, that the Aryans invaded and that there was a kind of a brutal takeover, conquest sort of thing. The horses and the fact that they had very advanced bronze tools led credence to that. However, archaeology in the Indus Valley has shown no signs of destruction, no signs of the sort of burning, looting, waste that war creates. And in fact, the Indus Valley civilization was in decline before the Aryans appear on the scene. We think it had something to do with the Indus River, which varied its course and left some of their cities in desolation, etc. But they were on decline and another group moved in. We don't know whether they fought. We don't know whether they lived together in peace and harmony and happiness. But the Aryan civilization has long been connected and known to be connected to Hinduism. Now, this is also challenged by not just by modern archaeologists, but by modern people in India who want to see the Hindu tradition as having primarily Indian origins, coming from India. And this is the Hindutva movement. This is India's own variation of our own beloved religious rite. And they try to reinterpret the history to make sure everything comes from the Harappan civilization. It's obviously, I think, false. A lot of these things move in through the Vedic tradition. So let's talk about the Vedas. The Vedas are the oldest and most important Hindu book of scripture. Despite that, almost no one has read it. So if you talk to a modern Hindu, they don't read the Vedas. They read the Bhagavad Gita, the Mahabharata, and these other stories that you've probably heard a lot more about. Those are much more, the Upanishads even, are much more influential than the Vedas. But the Vedas are more important in the sense that A, they're older, B, they're foundational, but they also become, at a later date, the measure of orthodoxy and Hindu-ness. So if you are a Hindu sect named Buddhism, for example, Buddhism is a Hindu sect. It's a sect of Hinduism. But it's a sect of Hinduism that rejected the Vedas. As such, it became a different religion, because the dividing line between that which is still Hindu and that which is no longer Hinduism has to do with acceptance of the Vedas. Other Hindu traditions that went the same direction as Buddhism, but that instead of rejecting the Vedas, reinterpreted them, stayed Hindu. Traditions that rejected the Vedas are no longer Hindu. So the Vedas are important, and the rituals described in them are still performed today, although they're not something people read. Think Leviticus. Who here reads Leviticus? I mean, Leviticus is boring. I mean, I'm sorry, but it's probably one of my favorite books of scripture, but to everyone else in the world, it's boring. But Leviticus is a ritual manual. That's what the Vedas are. They were preserved orally at first, and they were probably preserved really well. It was actually sacrilege to write them down. So they were oral, and they were oral on purpose. But because they were hymns that were sung and rituals that were performed, and because those rituals had to be done just right to be effective, they believed that if the ritual wasn't done right, it not only might not work, it might cause damage and backfire. So it had to be said just right, with just the right pitch, just the right words, just the right verbiage. And because of that, whenever the rituals were performed, several priests were there, Brahmin, and they would say the words, and there was one priest whose only job was to make sure the words were said right. So the entire vocation of being a priest involved memorizing the Vedas, because you had to recite them at ritual. And so although they were written down much later date, they're almost certainly much older and were probably preserved correctly through a very careful oral tradition. They were also secret. In fact, there was a tradition that if someone of a lower caste heard the words of the Veda, you were to pour molten lead into their ear, because they weren't allowed to. That was the punishment for hearing. Yeah, these are really great old traditions. But that's how seriously they took it as a secret. In fact, there's modern Hindus who will tell you that the reason the West suddenly jumped ahead of India in technology, in the 20th century, was because the Vedas were released. The secrets were leaked, and we use those secrets to jump ahead. This is a great conspiracy theory, but you get the idea of how seriously they take this, and it also reveals something important about what they believe about the importance of spoken word. The spoken word has power, real ritual and religious power. This reminds me of Genesis 1, where God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And so if you say the right words in the right way, with the right pitch, with the right tones, and perfectly memorized, then that has actual meritorious power. So their secret ritual manual, hymns, and they even have some philosophical speculation, but most of that is older, so there's sections of it that are older. In fact, I got some disagreement about whether the Upanishads are part of the Veda or something entirely different. But the Upanishads are entirely philosophical discussion about the nature of the self. It reads a lot like Buddhist texts would, but with some different assumptions. We will talk about the Upanishads next time, but they're not part of the Aryan tradition. They're part of what happens when the two synthesize later. So we're going to talk about them later. They believed that they were revealed to rishis. This is our first, these are early sages, meditative yogis. Well, if you ask somebody in America what they think about Hinduism, they usually talk about wild ascetic yogis, in loincloths, meditating on a mountaintop, that sort of thing. This is our rishi, although their exact nature isn't clear in the earlier texts. It depends. But they were seen, we know, as at least sages to whom the words of the Veda were revealed, but the words of the Veda are seen as older than the rishis. The rishis didn't write it. It was revealed to them because these are the divine words of heaven, sort of thing. This is also where we get the Om from. Right? The other thing we think about Hinduism is someone meditating, saying Om, Om over again. Right? One of the techniques for meditation is to concentrate and focus on a word, because that and a sound. You can, as a Buddhist tradition, is to focus on the breath, etc. Hindus will do that too. But you can focus on a hand gesture, on a word, on a sound. And in this case, the sound is supposedly the sound of creation. You imagine the world reverberating as it was created, and that's the echo of that sound of creation, and it has power. And you meditate upon that sound, and you go deeper into that sound until you achieve oneness with the rest of the universe and creation itself, and which is the experience people have when they meditate this way. So, the Veda has 4 parts. There's the Rig Veda, which is the oldest, thousands of hymns, probably written 2300 to 1200 BC. It has the mantras, which are the Om, the special sounds that you meditate on. The Yashir Veda, which has sacrificial instructions. This tells you how to offer sacrifice, and that was not a simple thing. You had, like I said, multiple priests. They would take weeks setting up a tent with very specific altars representing the three parts of the world, made with specific measurements, which again reminds you of Leviticus, right? You have to have just the right measurements of the tabernacle. And then we have the Sama Veda, which are melodies and hymns, and the Athara Veda, which are rituals and spells for things like healing and cursing, your enemy, that sort of thing. And these rituals are still practiced and used today. So here's the key concepts. There is first Rita. Rita is, how to describe Rita? I think we did this, right? Rita is the truth, justice, and the Hindu way, just as Ma'at is truth, justice in the Egyptian way. But it's the Hindu version of Ma'at, is the best way for me to think about it. The other is tapas. Tapas is the heat of desire and meditation and creation itself. It's that feeling you feel, and if you've ever done this, meditation is one of those things everyone ought to try. But if you've ever done this and you feel that warm kind of burning sensation right in the middle of your chest that kind of spreads out, that's tapas. And it's seen as the creative force that formed the universe. And the next is Atman. Atman is the soul or the spirit. It's also, we talked about this, the wind. In a very straightforward way, and one that's identical to the Egyptian and Mesopotamian traditions, the Hindus associated the soul and the spirit with the breath. Because as long as you're alive, there's a wind, breath, that lives inside of you. When you die, the wind goes away. Who knows where it goes? But that's the soul, so the soul goes somewhere after death. And so they call the soul the wind, the breath. The soul and the breath are synonymous, and then the question is, where does it go when you die? And they call this the Atman. When we get to the Upanishads, we'll have a lot more to say about the Atman, because the key concept of the Upanishads is probably the most audacious and yet possibly true, profound religious equivalence I've ever seen. We'll come to that later. I'm going to tease you with it and not give it to you. But see Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, where he says, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. This is how God creates Adam. On the right, we have an Egyptian image of the same idea. The text above him reads, Di Ankh Jed Medu, given life for time and all eternity. And she's holding out an Ankh, symbol of life, to his nose. Given life to the nose is another phrase we sometimes see in Egyptian tradition. It's about restoring the ability to breathe, which is where eternal life comes from. The Egyptians, however, see eternal life as resurrection. They want to come back to life, their body itself to come back to life. Hindus, the Vedas in the older parts are contradictory and uncertain about what happens when we die. There is no mention of reincarnation. It's probably a later tradition. Or it's a tradition from the Indus Valley civilization that merges at a little later date with the Vedas. But the earliest Vedic traditions don't have any mentions of reincarnation. They do talk about heaven. So the world has three parts. There's the world in which we now live, the sky, where the wind lives between heaven and earth, and the heavens above. This is also the same conception we see in the Hebrew Bible. It's common in the ancient Near East. And when you die, you either go to the underworld, where your body goes when you die, and you go to the dead in the underworld, or you go up to heaven and live up there. And they weren't clear, and they didn't seem to know. And they talked about both. And again, reincarnation then comes along later. And those are the cosmology, the three divisions we just mentioned. So the creation accounts that we see in the Vedas are also contradictory, and there's a lot of them. We get the cosmic egg theory. The world was a cosmic egg that hatched. We get a reference to the union of the sky and the earth, which sounds an awful lot like Shu and Geb in Egyptian tradition. Geb and Nut, excuse me. We also have the primordial waters, created out of the primordial waters, which is again something we get in Genesis, which is the deep. And a wind from God blew across the waters. That wind is this Atman, the spirit. Again, same thing. We also get one that's fun and shows up all over the place, and that's that the world was created through the dismemberment sacrifice of a primordial giant. That's actually a third creation myth that shows up in the Bible. It's not in Genesis 1 or 2, but it shows up later in Isaiah, where Isaiah mentions when God slew the dragon and created the world out of its body. This is the myth that the Canaanites told, only it was Baal who slew the dragon. If you're familiar with the Enuma Elish, when we talked about Mesopotamian religion, this is what Marduk does. Do you remember Marduk slays Tiamat and creates the world out of her corpse? And in this case, the gods slay a primordial giant and create the world out of his corpse. And they connected explicitly to sacrifice. And I believe that connection is intended in all the traditions. In other words, part of the sacrifice is to cut up the animal. And so the creation of the world through the cutting up of a primordial demon, giant, whatever, is a connection, a mythical connection to a ritual act. This is the same thing we saw in Egypt with the dismemberment of Osiris. But in this case, it's tied to creation instead of rebirth. For Osiris, it's tied to resurrection and rebirth, and here it's tied to creation of the world. And in both cases, it's tied to ritual, and ritual is tied to cosmic order and maintenance. Rita. You offer these sacrifices to make sure the world continues. See, the world was created through cutting up the primordial giant, and we cut up the sacrifices and offer the meat to the gods to make sure the world that they created in this way that we are duplicating on the earth continues. So we get the connection between sacrifice and creation. And the final one is called the Hymn of Creation, and I'm going to read it. So before I do, though, one of the things you notice is the contradictory. These creation accounts are contradictory, but Hinduism preserves them all because each one, they believe, captures a different piece of the truth. One is the leg, one is the tusk, one is the snake of the tail. And so the contradictions weren't important to them because they didn't think any of these accurately described everything. They're shadows against the wall, and each is casting a shadow from a different angle and illuminating a different part of the real truth behind the creation, which is none of these things. And so they were able to live with the ambiguity and the contradiction in a way that we would not be able to because we would see it differently. This is exactly our problem with Genesis chapter 1, which is a creation account from P. If you've been in my Bible class, on Genesis chapter 2, which is a creation account from J, which contradicts. But the collection of several different creation stories that contradict each other is normal in the ancient Near East. And so when it shows up in the Bible, it shouldn't be surprising. And here we have contradictory accounts in the Vedas. I'm going to read just one of them, though, because this is my favorite creation account from Hinduism. Let's go here. First of all, this is why I said that the Vedas contain some philosophical speculation. I want you to think for a minute about what is time before time itself exists. What is that like? Stephen Hawking has described that as trying to describe what is north of the North Pole, which is why I put the picture of the North Pole on there. Because time itself bends back on itself to the point where it closes, like the top of a basketball. And so at the Big Bang, time has a North Pole. And then the question is, what is north of the North Pole? And the answer is, you can't even say nothing, because nothing implies that there wasn't something. But that requires time. You can't really talk about, and space. You can't talk about nothing, because nothing is space with nothing in it. But when time and space themselves don't exist, what is there? That's a modern attempt to wrap your head around the same idea now, I'm not claiming these people knew modern cosmology. I'm saying they're trying to wrap their head around something that was itself outside of time itself, and recognizing the difficulty of doing that, which is exactly what we are doing today with modern physics and science, because we have the same problem. We can't conceptualize of what it even means. So here's what they say. Then even nothingness was not, nor existence. So there wasn't nothing, and there wasn't something. It's something that's neither nothing nor something. There was no air then, nor the heavens beyond it. What covered it? What was it? Where was it? In whose keeping? Was there then cosmic water in the depths unfathomed? That's the water creation that's shown, that's talked about everywhere. He says, is that what it was like? Then there was neither death nor immortality. People didn't live forever and they didn't die because there were no people. There was no existence itself. You see, nor was there, but there was no non-existence either. Nor was there even the touch of light, night and day. The one breathed windlessly and self-sustaining. There was that one then, and then there was no other. At first there was only darkness wrapped in darkness. All this was only unlimited cosmic water. That one which came to be, enclosed in nothing, arose at last, born of the power of tapas. In the beginning, desire descended on it. That was the primal seed, born of the mind. The sages who have searched their hearts with wisdom know that which is kin to that which is not. It's almost impossible to understand what he's talking about, which I think is the point. We'll see here in a minute. And they have stretched their cord across the void. Stretch their cord is how you build a building. You stretch your cord across and you snap it to, this is a line to like you build a building. But sounds like he's talking about the sages. At first I thought he meant the sages discovered the truth of what it was like before, and now he's almost implying that by thinking about it, the sages made it happen. The sages who wrote the Vedas created the world themselves through their philosophical musings about the creation of the world. It's a very exalted place for sages. And know what was above and what below. Seminal powers made fertile mighty forces. Below was strength, and over it was impulse. But after all, who knows? So he says all these things that make absolutely no sense, by the way. I don't claim to understand this. And then he says, who knows? And who can say whence it all came? And how creation happened? The devas themselves are later than creation. Now that's an interesting point. So who knows truly whence it has arisen? I'm going to stop and chat about that one for a minute, because this is a different view of gods. When we talk about the Vedic gods, we're going to do that in a minute. This point is I think, should be preeminent. In the Christian conception of God, they think of God as something outside of the universe itself, outside of time and space. Something that sets the laws of nature. A God, I call this a God of nature, because he's a God who himself creates the laws of nature. The Hindus conceive of God as a God in nature, meaning these are beings who are further ahead than us. In later tradition, I remember reincarnation hasn't entered the thought yet, but when it does, they'll talk about the gods are people who have been reborn into an even better state than us. If you're good enough, you get to be reborn as one of the devas. So these are people with incredible amounts of merit, but they're still subject to the laws of karma, and they're still subject to samsara and rebirth and Rita. So Rita and cosmic order themselves, they're subject to those laws. So if they were to do bad things would happen to them, etc. And Rita itself, it's almost like Rita and karma are preeminent even over the gods. Self-existent and kind of eternal principles. But the gods live inside of all that. There's a movement among some religious people today to talk about God as, if you look out into the universe in its infinity of space, there probably were civilizations who existed before us, who evolved to a point far beyond us. And if that were to happen, how would you ever differentiate between an advanced technological civilization and God? Something that maybe we are ants compared to would be divine from our perspective. These sorts of things show up in modern movies like Prometheus and the sort of thing where they theorize about these sort of divine, and you also get, they also become part of the conspiracy theories of the ancient alien TV shows that for some reason show up on the History Channel instead of the Stupidity Channel. I don't know why that is. But the idea is that if one of these ancient civilizations had visited us, which that part is possible, plausible, etc., they would be to us like gods. The idea that the aliens built the pyramids, however, and where they usually end up with that line of thinking is nonsensical. But each of those things would be gods in nature versus gods of nature. And we are obsessed with the God of nature because of our Christian background. The Hindus view a God in nature. So if you read, for example, Richard Dawkins, I'm going on a major tangent, but he writes in The God Delusion that it's entirely possible that we are living in a simulation. I can't prove it's not true. And he says it's also entirely possible that there are beings out there who are godlike. But they would not be God, he says, because they would have arisen by even the gods who created our simulation, they would have arisen by some process akin to natural selection. They didn't come up poof out of nothing. Of course, the universe came poof out of nothing, so I'm not sure I follow all of that logic, but I can say that his claim that these other things that he admits might exist, and in fact, in several places he says they probably do. The universe is large enough that they almost surely do exist somewhere. I don't know that they visited us, and I don't know, but if they did, they aren't gods. The problem with that entire line of thinking is it presumes a Christian concept of a God of nature. And again, if you broaden your scope to the Hindu version of this, gods in nature, he's wrong about whether those things are gods in the broader history of what constitutes a god. Anyway, sorry for the long tangent. The devas, gods themselves, are later than creation. You notice the world is created and then the devas come down into it. So who truly knows whence it has arisen? In other words, if the gods are part of creation just like we are, they weren't there when the universe was created. Do they know what it was like? Any more than we do? You can't even turn to the gods to know how creation works. So after having this long discussion about how creation works, he says, but we don't actually know how creation, how very Hindu of him. We don't actually know how creation works. And then my favorite passage is here at the end. Whence all creation had its origin, the Creator, whether it fashioned itself or whether it did not. The Creator, who sits in the highest heavens, it knows. Or perhaps it does not know. So okay. Again, this is kind of my favorite. This is my new favorite creation account because it essentially tries to get your mind to think about what duality is like. Non-existence is a thought. It's a category that is placed in duality with existence. Before creation, there was no existence, but that means there was also no non-existence. There was nothing, and nothing is neither nothing nor something. And we don't have the words or the mental capability to talk about what is north of the North Pole. And we also certainly don't have the ability to answer the age-old question, why is there something rather than nothing? And the Hindus have figured out the truth, that presupposing a God doesn't solve that mystery. Because now you're stuck with just another deeper mystery. Why was there a God rather than a non-God? How is that any better? So I criticize Dawkins for saying, he couldn't have existed out of nothing when the universe existed out of nothing. But the criticism cuts both ways. If you presuppose you have to have a God to explain why there's something rather than nothing, which I've heard a lot of religious people do, they defend their belief in God by saying, without God, there couldn't be, why is there something rather than nothing? There has to be a God. And that doesn't solve the problem. Which, of course, isn't my attempt to get you to believe one thing or the other. It's to recognize the depth and profundity of the problem. That religion doesn't solve it. Belief in God doesn't solve it. Belief in no God doesn't solve it. We don't know. why there's something rather than nothing. And maybe the highest God in heaven, maybe he knows, and maybe he doesn't. So, the deities are shiny, exalted. The Egyptian term here is Ak, which is also the shiny one, the exalted one. Same idea. They are also subject to Rita. And I'm going to give some list of some of them. One of them is Indra. A quarter of the Vedic hymns are composed in his honor. Now, to make a point here, the most important Hindu gods in later Hinduism would be Shiva, and some of these other deities. They don't show up in the early Vedas. The Vedas have a different pantheon that they're more interested in. Indra is the most important. He's a war god, but he's also a rain god. Think Baal and Zeus. By the way, Zeus, Deus is also Deva. Those words are also related. I don't know if I listed Zeus in my list of Deva cognates. But Baal is a storm god, and so is Marduk. So somehow this storm god who controls the rain, and so is Zeus with his thunderbolts, becomes this war god who also is the leader of the pantheons. Indra slew the primordial dragon to create the world. From the dragon, sometimes it's a primordial man, sometimes it's a primordial dragon. But Indra is our equivalent of Marduk and Baal and Zeus. Zeus also slays, was it Kronos, and creates the world out of his body, cuts it up. Same thing. The other deity we have is Agni, that you ought to know about. Agni is about a fifth of the Vedas are addressed to Agni. Agni is cognate with ignite. He's the fire deity. He's in charge of the sacrifice, and therefore he's the messenger and mediator because he conveys the sacrifice up to God. He also conveys the dead. Now, if you remember Zoroastrian tradition, they refuse to burn the dead. And the reason they give for not burning the dead is because the fire is pure, the dead carcass is impure. You don't put the impurity in the pure because that pollutes the fire. The fire is sacred. The real reason they don't do that is almost certainly because they are reacting to Hindu tradition and trying to do the opposite of what the Hindus do. The Hindus put the body in the fire for precisely the same reason. The fire is sacred, so it burns the body and takes it up to heaven with the smoke up to the sky and conveys the dead's Atman up into the sky, up into heaven. He's also associated with the tapas, that fire that dwells within us and that is the power of creation. He didn't create these things exist before him, but he is kind of the controller and mediator and channeler of the tapas and the fire. Varuna is a guardian of Rita. Again, the same thing. He didn't create Rita, but just like before the other guy controlled fire, this guy controls the Rita. His job is, like the Egyptian goddess Ma'at, to ensure truth, justice, and the Hindu way prevails. So if you do bad things, he's the one you have to apologize to and appease through sacrifice so that you're not punished for what you've done. And so many sacrifices are offered to him to kind of appease his wrath from poor deeds. Soma is also a deity, but Soma is also a plant. The word means to distill, extract, or sprinkle. He's the deity of plants and the moon and the intoxicating drink. Again, the Soma was drunk by Zoroastrians as well. So you remember Soma was a ritual drink of the Zoroastrians. There's a lot of speculation about what it is, a root, a plant, a mushroom probably. There's a lot of hints that it's a mushroom. We get even statues of people holding mushrooms. If so, we may be speaking of something akin to LSD. The descriptions of the experiences people had when consuming Soma sound an awful lot like an LSD trip. So it was some sort of an intoxicating hallucinogenic drink that made them feel like they were one with the universe. And that feeling, they believed, is the truth that is hidden. Instead of believing it's what happens to your mind when your mind breaks down its ability to distinguish between me and you, they believe that what's happened is the distinguishing between me and you is an illusion. And when you drink the sacred drink, it destroys that illusion and lets you see the world as it really is with no distinctions. There's also Rudra. He's called the Howler. He dwelled in the wilderness, wore animal skins, and brought sickness upon people, and paradoxically he's also a healer and possibly a prototype of Shiva. But Shiva himself as Shiva is not mentioned directly in the Vedas. They also believed in and had a highly stratified society. The Brahmins at the top were the priests, and they believed that this is related to the sacrifice of the Purusha. The Purusha is the primordial man, the being who was sacrificed and slain when the world was created. This is our dragon, man, whatever it is, depending. And the priests and teachers were made out of his mouth. The warriors and administrators were made out of his arms. The farmers and the people of the land were made out of his thighs. The merchants his thighs, and then the people of the land out of his feet. And so this probably represents the stratified society that the Aryans already had when they entered the Indus Valley. And this will evolve into the caste system in later Hindu tradition. It is not the caste system necessarily yet, but that is what it will become. But you'll notice that what the Vedas have just done is they've tied this stratified society to the very nature of the universe and to the order of the universe through the creation of the world itself. This is the will of an ordered universe and how the universe was created. And so to upset it would cause chaos and upset Rita, which is why there is so much opposition to the abolition of the caste system in India today. Again, reincarnation is not part of this tradition yet, but when it becomes part of the tradition, it is used as a justification for the caste system. I don't want to spend too much time talking about the caste system because our last class will talk about the modern political events that surrounded the attempts to abolish the caste system and the untouchables and Mahatma Gandhi, and we'll have that conversation. So I want to save a lot of that for then. But at this point, we're tying it in. And this description simply describes the pre-existing stratified Aryan society and ties it to creation. At later dates, it will be tied to reincarnation, because that way it seems a lot more just. People in a lower caste were born in a lower caste because they had less ritual purity and bad karma from a previous life. People born in a high caste were born there because of their meritorious acts in a previous life. That's why they're born into the caste they're born into. And once you combine reincarnation with this view, it not only becomes something that was previously stratified and tied to the nature of the universe, but it becomes justified by your own actions. So it's not like you were forced to be an untouchable because of a chance of your birth. You are an untouchable because of your actions. And if you live according to your caste and don't try to get out of your caste and try to do your duty as you're supposed to, you'll have a better rebirth. But it's your own fault. This is the same, just one second. This is the exact same excuse the Mormons used for withholding priesthood from black people for years. Because in Mormon tradition, there isn't rebirth, so to say, but there is an existence before this one. And then there's this existence, which is a test, and then there's an existence after this one. And in our pre-mortal life, those who were more valiant were born with white skin and able to hold the priesthood, etc. And those who were not valiant were born with black skin and were unable to hold the priesthood. So goes the excuse. And for years, Mormons didn't give black people the priesthood until they decided that that excuse, which doesn't actually show up in their scriptures, I might add, is just an excuse, and they claim it was the opinion of people at the time and was never doctrine, and now they give black people the priesthood, and they admit that that was wrong. So I don't want to claim that's a Mormon doctrine, but it was a Mormon teaching for many years that was used to justify a racial form of discrimination. And that's what we see with the use of reincarnation as a justification for a similarly oppressive caste system. So did you, go ahead, what was your question?
Oh, a comment really. But now that I've heard people talking about Hinduism and saying that was an early form of slavery. It kept its own
So the comment was that he had heard that there was an original, that the origin of the caste system and this stuff was actually that there was a system of slavery, and then the hierarchy was created to justify the slavery.
In North America, it was about the same kind of thing with the blacks.
Yeah, and by the way, the curse of Cain tradition was common in America, and it was used to, and Ham, which is right after the flood story, there's a curse of Ham. Those two are tied to people with black skin and was used to justify American slavery in the same way, even though the texts actually aren't about that, and they're actually mentioned a different group of people. That's even the wrong group of people. But people are good at taking their myths and using them to justify their institutions of slavery, etc. The caste system evolves from the Aryan stratified society, and it does so by adding reincarnation on top of this pre-existent concept of the different parts of society. Now, as it appears in the Veda, it's almost just like a description. And it doesn't say anything about how you can't move between castes or that the castes are fixed or anything. It just says, God, in fact, I could say something like that about American society, that the bankers were created out of the finger of God, and the farmers were created out of the feet of God, close to the ground, working the soil, and the mouth, and the politicians were created out of God's mouth, or the Purusha's mouths to spout lies, or whatever I wanted to do. And I could make that statement to describe the way society is stratified and set up today. Like the arms are the merchants, they do the thing. The warriors, the kings, and the thighs hold everything up, and they're the merchants in the communities, and the farmers are the feet, and they work the soil, and everything stands on them, or it doesn't work. I mean, that's a kind of a good description of our society as it sits right now. To turn that into a caste system requires something else. So it's possible that there was some slavery going on, and that this was then used to justify that. It seems more likely that what we have is a description of the current state of the world tied to creation that then gets... And of course, the problem here is we're speculating, so maybe I shouldn't speculate, but it looks to me like what we have is a description of the current state of the stratified society that then becomes dogma. But that happens all the time. People describe the world as it is in a religious text, and then people assume that means that that's the way that God wants the world to be, and any change from it is a problem. And that's sort of a normal thing that happens. The untouchables come because they live outside of caste. These are probably people who came in from outside of the area, were brought in, and then they weren't part of the caste system. If I were to go to India, I wouldn't have a caste. And when you don't have a caste, that makes you an outcast. And that's where that term comes from. And so the untouchables are the outcasts, or the people who don't have a caste, and they eventually later they will turn them into their own caste because they don't fit with the feet, the thighs, the arms, the mouth. There's something else. Notice the connection of the Brahmins with the mouth. These are the priests, because they speak the holy Veda. The mouth speaks. And the Veda has that, again, we talked about it earlier, that ritual significance with those special words that when they're spoken have this meritorious effect. Okay, so let me give you some resources. You can't really read that talk very well. It's http://www.sacred-text.com/HIN for Hinduism /rigveda/index.html. There is a copy of the Veda online that I found. That's the copy I found. There's actually a couple, but that's the one I found. So if you actually want to read the Vedas, which is the primary religious text we've talked about today, there's a link there you can use. The other is Great Courses. The Great Courses catalog has all sorts of college-level classes on lots of subjects. If you buy them from their catalog, they sometimes run several $100s. They're really expensive. If you happen to have an Audible subscription, because I like to listen to stuff when I drive to and from work, it turns out you can get one of the great courses for a credit, which you get one a month. And so that's where I get all my great courses from. And there's a really good one called Great World Religions Hinduism, and they have Great World Religions Christianity, they have lots of them, Great World Religions Islam, and etc. But this one was really good. It's by Mark M. Musi, I think is how you say his name, and I have to admit I've stolen an awful lot of today's class from his class. He did a really good job of covering this subject, and I've used a lot of his ideas and material to make sense of what I'm supposed to cover. The other one is God is Not One, the 8 Rival Religions That Run the World and Why Their Differences Matter by Stephen Prothero. I've recommended that book, and I'm recommending it again and again and again. I love this book, and it has a chapter on Hinduism, which is much shorter than a long course on Hinduism itself, just one chapter in a book with many religions covered. So one chapter on Islam, one chapter on Christianity, and he has a chapter on Hinduism that is excellent because it condenses the entire subject down much more concisely than I'm able to do, in fact. And so he'll have just one chapter that really covers the idea amazingly well. There's so much in it that he covers, but he does it so well in so few words. So I really recommend that book, especially if you want to learn more about religion. And so next time, and I don't believe that'll be next month, it'll probably be the month after because I will be out of town next month when the class is supposed to happen for work. But the next time we have our class, which will probably be in October, we'll cover philosophical Hinduism. By philosophical Hinduism, I mean the Upanishads and the speculation on the soul. They talk about meditation. This is where meditation, reincarnation, renunciation, karma, rebirth come on the scene and become part of Hinduism proper, and probably where Hinduism proper is born. And this is where the speculation that you are God comes from. And it's one of, like I said earlier, I teased this idea, it's one of the most audacious concepts in all of religion. And yet when you realize what they're talking about, it's also probably the most likely to be true. And so we're gonna discuss that. We're gonna discuss what they mean by that, and it's a very complicated idea with deep philosophical roots, and it's akin to the Buddhist tradition of no self. The Buddhists will say the illusion that you are a separate self is an illusion. You aren't a separate self. There's just consciousness there, and they'll say that by saying there is no self, no Atman. There is no Atman. The Hindus will say your Atman that you think is yourself is not really separate from the other person's Atman. We all have the same Atman, and that means we are all one, and that our separateness is itself an illusion. You can see the similarity to Buddhism. And because our separateness is an illusion, we are all part of a larger whole that you could describe as God, if you wanted. And that's a matter of definition, whether you call that God or not. If it's true, which seems there's reason to suspect it might be, and we'll talk about it, it's an audacious statement, but it's also fascinating and philosophical and hard to pierce, and we'll have to spend a whole class on it, and when we're done we probably still won't understand it. But that'll be next time, and it should be a lot of fun. So I hope to see you there. Thank you for coming. Have a good day, and I'll see you in a few months.